So the budget is next week. So our fake election campaign is going to kick into real election campaigning after that. On the podcast this year, we've talked a lot about politicians and their messaging. But today I thought we would talk about exactly who they're talking to. Where do you think they're starting from in this campaign, Lenore?
Well, I guess it seems to be an electorate that's not really wildly enthusiastic about either leader. Anthony Albanese's been making up a bit of ground in the polls. Peter Dutton's been doing a bit better than expected, but it doesn't feel like there's a groundswell of enthusiastic support for either of them. They don't seem to be wildly enthusiastic about either major party for that matter. I mean, we know that well over 30% of the electorate voted for non-major parties at the last election. I think that's going to be more at this election. I think there was a really interesting discussion on our podcast Back to Back Barry's the other week about exactly that matter. So, I mean, that's interesting. And it means that the election will almost inevitably result in a hung parliament one way or the other. We don't know what impact this mass advertising from Clive Palmer's whatever it is party is going to have. The electorate we know is pissed off because of cost of living and remains pissed off because of cost of living and the fact that their material circumstances are difficult. We know demographics are changing, so millennials and Gen Zs will outnumber boomers in this electorate. So if you put all that together with the fact that there's also disengagement in large parts of the electorate, I think we're seeing sort of not just cyclical shifts, but quite qualitative shifts in how the electorate is viewing politics, how the electorate thinks about politics. And I think that makes it a really, really interesting and kind of unpredictable starting point for the major parties as we go into a campaign.
And what exactly do we know about those shifts? How has the electorate changed over the past few years?
I guess it's always hard to pin down a question like that. I think it's changed in many ways. The one thing we do have as fact is that what Lenore was referring to was the decline in the share of vote for the major parties. So that was less than 10% in the 80s. It went up to about 20% around the turn of the century, fell away a little bit, and then now it was expanded massively to above 30% at the last election. So that's the one thing we definitely know for sure, is that people are looking for something that is not the two major parties. But what that thing is very variable. So it's like a splintering. It's like people are looking for the Greens, they're looking for urban independence, they're looking for rural independence in some cases, they might be looking for single issue parties. They voted in large numbers for Pauline Hanson at one point and still do to some extent. So there are all kinds of different ways that the electorate is dividing, and that makes it exceptionally hard for the major parties to settle on a single strategy that's going to appeal to voters in the way that we feel it used to. And also their support bases are changing as well in perhaps unpredictable ways for them and again divergent ways, but broadly speaking sort of dividing on different lines than they used to, dividing much more on things like education, whether they live in inner cities or outer suburbs or rural areas, rather than on a kind of ideological set of assumptions about class or about what kind of jobs they do. So it's all that makes it really difficult for the parties to settle on a strategy, and they have to. What it means is they have to come up with strategies, plural, and different ways of engaging with the voters and different messages to send to different groups of voters.
We've just published a long essay from Rebecca Huntley, who has spent years looking at the electorate and doing really, really deep research into what they believe, how they behave, what they want from politicians. There's a lot in it, but one of the things that really jumped out at me was that politicians need to worry less about their messaging and what their message is, and more about that people are actually listening and engaged. So how do politicians reach voters in that kind of setup?
You're right. I think that was the most interesting thing from that very interesting essay by Rebecca Huntley that we published on Thursday, is that the thing that best predicts how someone will vote isn't the things that used to predict it, like demographics or geography or ideology. It is how engaged and active they are in public life. That is the best indicator of how they will vote or how they engage with politics. And Rebecca has sort of divided the electorate into different groups according to engagement to sort of look at that phenomenon. But for politicians, it means that given that there is a big section of the electorate, particularly men, and particularly men in regional or outer suburban areas, politicians have to find different ways to get to those people. They're not listening, sadly, to this podcast, probably. They're not reading the mainstream
Come on.
media.
Of course they are.
Okay. Men in regional and rural areas who are disconnected with politics. Hi, thanks for listening. But you know, they're finding different ways to get to those people, to get to younger people through podcasts, through all kinds of social media strategies, younger voters through TikTok. Like, they have to completely change the way they communicate and who they communicate with to find those voters and to get their messages through to those voters. It's a challenge for us in the media because that sometimes means going around the media through different media. It means that when they do that, their messages aren't challenged in the same way as a journalist would challenge them. But I can understand from a politician's point of view why you do that, because you have to get there somehow or other. We saw that was really consequential in the US election. So I think that's one of the really interesting things.
We've already seen Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton start campaigning in different ways, I think. Have you noticed that, Lenore?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they're going on podcasts that aren't really media podcasts. I think Anthony Albanese went on Abby Chatfield's podcast. Adam Bant did a DJ set with Abby Chatfield. They've been on Mark Bouris, the businessman's podcast. I think Peter Dutton did a Diving Deep podcast, which I hadn't heard of this person, but apparently he's an Olympic diver turned social media star with 5.8 million YouTube subscribers. So what would I know? Anyway, they're going on all of these different podcasts to, you know, with legitimate reason to reach these audiences. I think they're really ramping up what they're doing on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. They are adapting.
So I was reading a different essay as well as Rebecca Huntley's excellent one in preparation for this podcast, and it started, "We're living at a time, it is widely remarked, when voters are increasingly disengaged from politics, distrustful of politicians and the political process, and disenchanted with the major parties." That was written in 2002 by Murray Goot. He actually ended up, at the end of the essay, he ended up concluding that the extent of the discontent has been exaggerated and decontextualised. But it's true that people at that time, or for a long time, have been talking about similar things, and that drift away from the major parties is one of them. But the difference now is more than 20 years later is social media and all the other ways of communicating, which have multiplied the difficulty factor in reaching, in addressing disengagement as it was then. Like, people have been worried about it for a long time, and these are, in some cases, long-term trends. I think it's true now that they are disaffected in a somewhat different way from before. They're angrier, they're kind of more grumpy with the way politics is carried out, and it's similarly harder to reach them because of all these different means of information flows that they're receiving, all the different ways people engage with information now.
And I think that leads to the sort of fundamental disconnect or tension that must be really difficult to deal with if you're a political party or a politician, which is voters really want something to change. They're looking for a big idea, something that shakes up the system. But at the same time, the way voters get information makes it really easy to run a very effective scare campaign against a big idea. So on the one hand, they want a big idea. On the other hand, if you come up with a thought through big policy idea, you've then got to run the gauntlet of the scare campaign with social media memes or, you know, the things that we know can happen to try to get it through to the people. And what can come through the middle of that is sort of the appearance of a big idea, which is really just a very big personality, a big political personality without actually formulated ideas, which is, you know, really dangerous.
We have talked a lot about how hard it is to run those big policy, I guess, big target campaigns, but there's also a saying in politics, you know, don't run the last election campaign. People do want something to change. Do you think that could translate to wanting ambitious policy ideas this time, or are politicians still walking that line of not wanting to spook the voters?
Well, look, the other thing that is in the firmament this time is a very, very scary international situation where everything is being turned on its head. So, you know, if I was running in this election, I wouldn't be putting another potentially scary idea on the table. I would be offering cost of living relief so that people understood that I was concerned about their material circumstance, and I would be seeking to portray my belief that I could deal with the security and geopolitical consequences of what was going on. And those would be the two main things that you'd need to do. You know, absent what is happening in the US, you might be right. It might be time for another idea. But given that that is happening and the world is a scary place, I wouldn't put anything else on the table other than cost of living relief that could be used to make another scare campaign.
I think the other way to look at that policy question, perhaps a slightly more encouraging and optimistic way, is that people aren't just looking for policy, they're also looking for, and this is a massively overused phrase, but they're looking for authenticity in their politicians. And to some extent, that's separate from what they're actually offering in policy terms. And I mean, you could also argue that someone like, people see authenticity in someone like Donald Trump. They can see it in kind of very different ways. But there are different groups of people who are looking for something that is not the professionalised, party-driven way of doing politics, where the two major parties, most of their MPs have come up and have spent most of their working lives inside the party. They talk the party lines, they follow the talking points, and they've lost the ability to speak directly and openly and honestly to the electorate. We ran an interesting story this month about a different sort of identifying a different group of people in rural areas of Australia, called with an acronym, inevitably CURVS, which stands for Conservative Uncommitted Rural Voters with Environmental Sympathies, which you may think is quite a small group, but I think it's an interesting suggestion in that there are lots of people in this, it's just one example, in the country who are conservative in a very genuine sense and also like conservationists, if you like, believe in the environment, believe in climate change.
Work in the environment.
Yeah, but are not radicals. They're not teals in the sense of the...
But they're the voices of people. Like
Exactly.
That's the Cathy McGowan people, right?
Exactly. And it will be fascinating to see in this election whether that group or another group that maybe we haven't even thought of yet comes to the fore in electoral terms and produces more surprises. I think that's what I'm going to be looking for in this election, perhaps above all.
The other thing I thought was interesting in Rebecca Huntley's essay was her finding that our belief in a fair go is waning, that it's going down the order of things that people are worried about, particularly among younger voters, which, if you think about it, is entirely understandable in that if you're not getting a fair go in terms of housing or your life chances, it would be much harder to believe in a fair go. I think that's entirely reasonable and understandable. But then I can't really predict how that's going to translate. Does it translate in sort of volatility of the vote? I mean, where do those people who feel that way quite justifiably, where do they go? And sort of in contrast to that, there is the other findings of many surveys which shows that younger voters are not becoming conservative as they age in the way that previous generations are, possibly because they haven't amassed the wealth and assets to conserve, if you want to simplify it. So I think how that factor plays out is also really interesting.
Yeah, the one thing we haven't really seen in Australia, in contrast to a lot of other countries, is the rise of a populist or even far-right party, which will suck up that disaffection. And I mean, you could say that's because we've had one for quite a long time in one nation.
In one nation,
but
yeah.
It's not booming. It's not accelerating anymore. It's kind of in static or even declining in its vote share. And no one else, not Clive Palmer, not any other kind of group of independents or party has taken its place. I mean, partly that reflects our electoral system, but it does feel like the mood in Australia is more one of kind of grumbling dissatisfaction rather than actual white-hot anger that would drive people to a really radical alternative. But, maybe we'll be surprised in a bad way in the election. Who knows?
Do you think that's a sign of hope, or do you think that means we have to be very vigilant that the current grievances don't tip over into that white-hot anger?
I think that it's something political parties and politicians need to be mindful of. And, one thing that makes me a bit hopeful is that if there is a hung parliament after the next election, then that forces whatever major party ends up forming government to listen to at least some of those other voices that are sitting on the crossbench. It will force a moderation of their policies. It's very difficult to see, even if Peter Dutton did find a way to form government, that he could do it with a coalition of crossbenchers who back his nuclear plan, for instance, or who back the idea that you don't need to engage on climate policy. There are other moderating forces that would come to bear if Anthony Albanese forms a government in a hung parliament. In a way, a hung parliament would be a kind of check and balance on the major parties to actually listen to the people that the voters had put there.
Which is why it has been very interesting and also a little bit funny at times to see some sections of the media talk about the prospect of a hung parliament as a complete disaster for the
Terrible.
country.
Yep.
In all of this, what should the media, us, be taking away from these findings? Do we approach readers in a different way? Do we have to think differently about how we engage people?
I think we need to be conscious that we're listening and looking and figuring out what's really happening in the electorate, which is a difficult thing to do, but we have a number of projects in train to try to do that better in this election campaign. And we need to look at campaigning where it is happening. There's no point just looking at television advertising and thinking you know how the parties are messaging. You need to look at what's happening on TikTok, what's happening on Instagram, what's happening on YouTube. That's where much of the messaging is being pushed out, and often in contradictory and different ways to different audiences. So keeping a brief over the whole campaign is becoming way harder.
And I think the key to all that, as a sort of overarching principle, is that we're trying to listen to the electorate in the same way that we hope politicians or campaigners are trying to listen to the electorate to mould their campaigns. So we are also trying to do that to mould our reporting. We're running interviews with voters just about their lives, not so much about their politics, but about their lives in the run-up to the election and how that influences their voting, in the series called Anywhere But Canberra. Apologies to all our listeners in Canberra, about how their lives have changed over the past few years has led them to their voting decision. We're a relatively small media organisation. It's a big country and a lot of people with a lot of divergent views. So it's hard to, as we said at the outset, it's hard for us to capture the whole essence of a campaign, just as it is for the parties. But that's what we're trying to do, is to sort of get inside at least some parts of it to pick up on little strands of thinking that may give an insight into how things are developing.
Now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads this week. What was that for you, Lenore?
I wish it was something cheery, Bridie, but it's not that cheery. A jury in North Dakota has decided that the environment group Greenpeace has to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to the pipeline company Energy Transfer over behaviour by protesters over the Dakota Access Pipeline. You remember those protests like way back in 2016 and 2017. They claim that the organisation, or the claim that's been upheld, is that Greenpeace incited people to protest by using misinformation. Many of the jury seem to have ties to the fossil fuel industry. They've awarded Energy Transfer at least $660 million. Greenpeace is appealing. So basically in America, if you attack the Capitol, including if you attack the Capitol with violence to overturn a democratic election, you get a pardon. But if you're an environment group that assists in the organisation of a peaceful protest against a fossil fuel project, you get a $660 million fine.
The mind boggles, as it does every week at the moment at the news.
Every week and all the time.
Every day.
Yeah, true. Mike, what about you? What can't you get out of your head?
So my one is to do with English football, a subject dear to my heart. And last weekend, Newcastle United, which is one of the bigger clubs in England, very large, huge fan base, but profoundly unsuccessful. The last time they won a trophy was in 1955, famously. They finally did it
and
again.
They still have fans from
They have many
1955.
fans. They have
This is what I love about
hundreds
football,
of thousands
though.
of fans. They finally won a trophy again on Sunday, beating Liverpool in the final of the Carabao Cup sponsored tournament. But there is another side to this, which is that Newcastle recently have been owned by Saudi Arabia, essentially, by their investment fund. And there was a lot of pushback against that, understandably. It's kind of this contrast between the absolute passion and love for the team of the fans, and the really galling fact that they are now owned by essentially by a foreign country, and not just any foreign country, but a regime that is pretty distasteful in lots of ways. Barney Ronay wrote a good piece for us about that conflict as well, and it was also dealt with on the Guardian Football Weekly podcast, which most coverage in the UK has not dwelt on. But I think it's a really difficult tension for lots of people, not just in English football, but in sport around the world, to sort of manage that conflict between loving your club and not necessarily loving the people who own it.
I hate that their euphoria has been punctured, because what a long-awaited for win. But we can't just put those things to the side either.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this week, Mike.
Thanks, Bridie.
And thank you, Lenore.
Thanks, Bridie.